Nathan Ortiz, Designing for More Than Data, a trans perspective on digital accessibility and identity. Ali Camp. Gold sponsors, ANZ, Intopia and Telstra. Silver sponsors, Canva and Coles. Supporters, Rumour, the design recruiter.
All right. Thank you. First off, sorry if I'm a bit coffee and all that. I'm also found myself to be a victim of Melbourne's allergy season, so just trying to get through that. I want to preface that some of this content is going to be based on my personal experience as a trans person navigating digital experiences and does not necessarily reflect the experience of other trans people or of intersex users or anything like that. And then another note on the content that I will briefly reference mental health things such as depression, anxiety, gender dysphoria, and so forth. So to take a minute, I want to talk about, I think most of us has probably come across personalization in the websites and the apps that we use. We might log into an account, see our name, welcome Sarah, hi Stuart. And some of us might think, oh, that's cute, it's lovely. Some of us might think it's a bit annoying. But some people, a trans person, might see it and feel their stomach drop. And that's because what they see, it's not really their name. They see an old name, one that doesn't necessarily reflect who they are, one that might even bring them pain or discomfort. And these situations are things that I call impersonal personalization, where something like a small personalization feature for many can actually be a very distressing and unexpected experience for others. Don't worry, it gets a bit darker. All right, so moving on with the agenda, I'll give a bit of an intro. We'll talk about core identity markers, what those are, why they matter. And then most of it's gonna be, real quick, the slide's not centered. Yeah, let's get that fixed. So we'll talk about how impersonal personalization harms, and then moving into how inclusive identity design is for everyone, and then moving forward, what we need in terms of research, standards, and intention. I'm trying to move slowly, but okay, we can read that. So, introduction and context section. I think we'll pause here. Show of hands, though, how many people have experienced personalization? Yeah, a lot of us, right? It's a pretty common thing, and one thing I've noticed that as time goes on, it seems to be we're reaching towards a place where it's like everything is about personalization, It just becomes more and more. And I think on the panel that was on earlier, I think Natasha was talking about how we might start seeing these AI versions of ourselves. And that was just so interesting to me because from my experience, a lot of times our identities are so misrepresented, right, when it comes to personalization. So I was thinking about, what would happen in a situation like that, and would those identities really represent who we are? So this content is especially relevant as we head towards that kind of AI, the AI age. And this is just me stalling as well. Okay. Yay! A little bit of the top is cut off, but that's all right. Okay, so to continue with some terms, when I say sex, I'm going to be talking about the biological and physiological characteristics of people. Intersex is going to be those natural variations of biological traits that don't typically fit within a male or female. It's actually estimated that about 1.7% of all births are intersex. It's not considered an abnormal condition. It's actually considered a natural variation of humans, okay? So with gender, those are going to be socially constructed characteristics. And then cisgender or cis is going to be referring to someone whose gender identity matches the sex that they were registered at birth. Transgender or trans is going to be when someone's gender identity doesn't match the sex that they were registered at birth. So non-binary is someone's gender identity is not constrained within that binary of man, woman. And then to misgender someone is to refer to them in a way that does not reflect their gender. So I also like to talk a bit about history because especially in the media these days, there's this idea that trans people just kind of spawned out of nowhere in the last couple decades, when really gender diverse cultures have been documented like 7,000 years ago. Ethnographic research has shown us that there was really no rigid two-gender system that was in place. It wasn't really until at European colonization that we started seeing the criminalization and the erasure of these identities. You know, people started seeing it as, oh, this is a sickness that needs to be cured. So in many indigenous societies, you know, being gender diverse was considered acceptable, not just acceptable, but it was celebrated. People were seen as wise. They were held as sacred. They held a lot of positions like mediators, healers, and so forth. So to sum that up, we're here, we've been here, we will continue to be here. So when we talk about gender-inclusive design, it's often framed around the question, do trans people feel seen and welcome using this? And while that is absolutely an important question, arguably more important, we need to be asking, can trans and intersex people actually use this thing? Because when design choices start creating real barriers, impact cognitive and emotional well-being, we are moving forward past the point of inclusion and into the realm of accessibility. And that's especially relevant when we talk about gender dysphoria. Now, this is a psychological distress that results from an incongruence between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Not all trans people experience this, nor are diagnosed with it. And I want to be 100% clear about that. Being trans is not a disability. This is a distress that can sometimes occur when people are trans. Treatment involves gender-affirming care. And when I say that, most people think, oh, medical, surgical choices, when really that's just one domain of gender-affirming care that not everybody even wants. What we're going to focus on is going to be more in the social domain, which includes maybe changing your name, changing pronouns, trying on new clothes, and so forth. So something interesting happened. In 2022, a US federal court ruled that gender dysphoria is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, I don't know of a case in Australia yet, but it can be reasonably said that it might also fall within the scope of Australia's Disability Discrimination Act. So we don't have any web standards that exist. There's nothing about this. Unfortunately, the only thing I've ever seen with sex and gender is this mouthful. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, Input Purposes for User Interface Components Taxonomy System. And what this does, it categorizes only one field purpose for both sex and gender. It directs you to use the sex attribute, and it maps it to gender identity. And this reinforces some harmful assumptions about gender and sex, and developers are going to end up mishandling that data, and I don't blame them. That's actually really confusing. So now we have this legal basis of we need to make these things accessible for people with gender dysphoria, but what do we do? So there's not much to go off on, but one thing we can do is focus on core identity markers and start seeing those things differently. So these are personal identifiers that shape how people are recognized and represented. The ones we want to focus on are going to be four: pronouns, name, gender, prefix / title. And we want to focus on these ones because they are ones that often change as a result of pursuing gender-affirming care. Some people might try on different names, different variations and combos of pronouns before they find one that really sticks. So these changes are personal things. They are, it's not just like a data update. It's not like updating your Instagram handle handle and for funsies type of thing. So yeah, we want to keep that in mind. And while people go through this process of exploration, there are very real barriers and realities that people face. And one being the process of a legal name and gender change is often inaccessible. It's often not possible depending on where you live in the world, and it can be very expensive. So the key thing here is that many trans people are navigating these digital experiences with a name and gender that does not match their legal records. So systems that fail to respect these core identity markers and how they change can unintentionally harm or exclude trans people. And that brings us to how impersonal personalization harms. So how do our identities end up being so misrepresented? Well, assumptions like many things in accessibility, assumptions based on our data create an identity for us that is not actually ours. And a common way this happens is an identity binary trap. And here on the slide, I've got a screenshot from Canva where I was looking for image examples of gender on a form, which was the search query. And this perfectly demonstrated what I'm trying to explain. The results that come up are asking for sex on a form for gender, and then 2 checkboxes, one for male, one for female. Now, one of the main issues with this is that it lists binary options, right? We know intersex people exist. There are more than 2 genders, which I won't go into, that'll take hours. And then the other main issue that we're gonna focus on for this is that it treats sex and gender terms as interchangeable. So we talked about it a little bit before, but just to reiterate, sex, we're talking chromosomes, hormones, reproductive organs. Gender, that's more norms, behaviors, roles and expressions, right? Socially constructed characteristics. So both of these things exist on spectrums, but they're 2 different concepts that don't always align in the way that society expects. So sex and gender, different concepts, therefore different terms. Some sex terms will be male, female, intersex. Gender terms are gonna be man, woman, trans man, cis man, non-binary, so forth. So let's say I were to have ticked off on that form female, because female is the sex that I was registered at birth. Well, what ends up happening a lot of times is an identity mapping error. And these are errors that occur when a system incorrectly records, interprets, or makes assumptions about someone's identity based on the data that was provided. So if I would have ticked off female, and this has happened many times, the system might go, okay, we're gonna give them a gender of women, pronouns are gonna be she, her, we'll give them a feminine looking avatar, and then we'll address them as miss in greetings, whether it's email or so forth. So what are the real world consequences of this? And I need to read this one off the card because this is a tough one. On this slide is a diagram illustrating 4 key areas of real world consequences: misgendered, compromised safety, access denied, and discrimination. Each area is connected by horizontal lines, while vertical lines branch out to show the different ways these consequences can occur, demonstrating how they realistically intersect and influence one another. So if we look at the misgendered key area, that happens in greetings a lot of times, opening the app like we talked about, in emails, maybe profile information, even targeted ads geared towards a gender that's just not relevant. Compromised safety is another key area. Lack of privacy is, it's a very big deal. I feel like trans people are not really afforded the same privacy as many other people are. An example would be, and this ties into how our identities might be outed, which is, it's a situation where somebody might, find out that I'm trans and I didn't consent to that information being out there. I used to work at a grocery store. There was no way to manually update our names in the scheduling system. And at the time when I started as Nathan, right? But my legal records were not updated yet. So what would happen was a lot of times the managers who made the schedules would forget that my name's Nathan. And so I would come into work for my shift and see my old name plastered for the entire store to see. And then before I know it, I'm trying to enjoy my microwave burrito in the break room, and then Cynthia, my colleague, is asking me questions about, how do you pronounce your old name? And when did you know you were trans? And then the questions kept coming. And then that led to other experiences later on where I was misgendered by other colleagues. So it was a very uncomfortable experience. It did take a mental health toll, but in the end, really, my safety was not really compromised, but the same cannot be said for a lot of other people, especially for trans women who have ended up in similar situations and have met tragic outcomes because they are more prone to violence and discrimination. So we look at also, health erasure, our identities being erased in healthcare. Moving into the key area of access denied. Gendered content and services. I've signed up for a telehealth app and tried to request a specific appointment for a specific service and was denied. An error showed up that said, this service is not available for your gender. We get validation errors. Identity verification is a massive pain point for trans people. There's actually a lot of trans people on LinkedIn who have unfortunately been banned from the platform and have lost their accounts because they cannot recover them due to, I think, quote it was, they misrepresented their identity because they were using a name that doesn't match their, their legal records. And so that is a massive pain point. Discrimination. I've been accused of fraud. I was on the phone with my banking app. I answered all of my security questions correctly, and at the end, they just said, well, you got everything right, but you just don't sound like you should. So yeah, and we see that in bias in algorithms, analytics reporting, and things like that. So what's really the psychological impact? Well, we know a mild impact might be frustration, confusion when we see these things, but on a higher level, gender dysphoria has a lot of symptoms and common coexisting conditions that range from self-harm, eating disorders, difficulties in relationship and work, depression, distress, maybe misuse of substances, social avoidance, mood disorders, irritability, anxiety, and that is not a comprehensive list. That is just a lot of things that do sometimes happen for people. And we know from research that more frequent and more hurtful misgendering experiences are connected to worse mental health outcomes, such as increased anxiety, depression, and stress. And interestingly, we've seen that high social support kind of acts as a buffer, protects people when they're feeling as stigmatized or hurt from when they're misgendered. So my question is, how do these things translate to a digital context? What happens when the system is the one doing the misgendering, or when it's the one that's giving the support? I can personally say that being misgendered by an interface it's strange, but it's also very cold. It's impersonal. It takes the human being out of it. There's nobody to talk to. There's nobody to, correct or maybe somehow get it right. So it can almost be worse. And it did trigger anxiety, gender dysphoria for me. But on the other hand, when it got it right, I didn't feel the same mental health toll that I often feel when it gets it wrong. So moving into how, much like the curb cut effect, inclusive identity design is really for everyone. And that's because cis people, they often change their personal identifiers too. Maybe not so much gender, but when it comes to name, prefix, titles, there are many reasons why. It could be marital, marriage, divorce reasons, cultural reasons, personal preference, professional, artistic preferences, even family adoptions, privacy or safety reasons, spelling, pronunciation, and legal or administration reasons. And it's very similar for when they change their prefixes and titles, right? Again, for marriage might be Miss to Mrs. or Mrs. back to Miss for divorce. Religious reasons, military reasons such as changing rank. It really goes on and on. I had to put in nobility or aristocracy in there in case any of us have one of our Princess Diaries moment. So it could happen, but really, we're talking about rigid systems. Updating identity information for users is often confusing, time-consuming, manual, kind of like how the scheduling system I talked about, inaccessible, and sometimes just impossible. And the point is that identity is fluid, not just for trans people, not for intersex people, but it's really fluid for everybody. And flexible systems are going to benefit everyone. So moving forward, what we need in terms of research standards and intention. Well, one of the things we could do is follow best practices, which is one, decoupling sex and gender will go such a massive way. If we do one thing and one thing only, it would be to not use those things as interchangeable. We can avoid assumptions about people's identities. We can ensure users can update their information easily, and then use inclusive language where we can. We also need to make sure we're being intentional, only ask when necessary. If you're designing a form and you get that burning desire to put gender on the form for whatever reason, stop and ask yourself, is the user's behavior different depending on their gender? An example would be the Bumble dating app, where only women can make that first move. In that case, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. Will their gender affect their experience with the product? An example could be non-cis women who use menstrual products. The Always brand actually used to have the Venus symbol on their wrapping, which is also known as the female symbol. They ended up removing it because of all the feedback they were getting from their non-binary customers. Is this data meaningful? Is it really necessary to understand the product audience? And is it relevant? And the reasons why we want to ask these things is because collecting gender identity has shown that increases the risk of workplace discrimination and the risk of that data being mishandled, which can compromise the safety of trans people. We also really need more research. There's not a lot out there on this. How do findings of misgendering and invalidation translate to these digital experiences? We don't really know the impacts of these experiences or on the well-being of trans and intersex communities. Trans and intersex participants should absolutely be included in usability testing and in accessibility research. While we're filling the gaps, we need to make sure that we're being intentional and careful about how we collect that data to make sure that people's privacy and identities are respected to prevent that sort of misuse. In the future, I do see that collecting more user research data can help inform and shape future standards. So to summarize that up, gender-inclusive design is an accessibility issue. Building systems that respect all gender identities is essential for creating these equitable digital experiences. Core identity markers matter. Names, pronouns, and other information, they're dynamic, they're meaningful for many people, not just for trans people. Systems that accommodate everyone, should accommodate everyone, right? Not just marginalized groups. And then we talked about how impersonal personalization harms users. Assumptions built into these systems can negatively impact mental health, trust, and engagement. It's really important that we allow users the freedom to self-identify. And then moving forward, research standards and intentionality are just so needed. Closing gaps in guidance and adopting careful consent-driven practices will ensure that sensitive identity data is handled responsibly as we move forward. Thank you.
Ali Camp, celebrating 10 years.